The email came on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate. Bad news always seems to arrive midweek when you're too far from the weekend to pretend it doesn't matter. It was from my stepmother. The subject line read, "Owen's retirement dinner. Important notes for guests." I'd been expecting the invitation for weeks. My father was retiring after 32 years as a cardiovascular surgeon, and the family had been planning the celebration like it was a state funeral. I poured my coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened it. The email had two parts. The first was the invitation itself. Saturday, April 19th, the Whitmore Club, black tie, 7 o'clock. The second part was a note addressed specifically to me. She had typed it in a different font. I don't know why that detail stuck with me, like she'd switched fonts to make sure I understood it was personal. "Ivy, we want the evening to feel cohesive and polished. This is your father's night, and first impressions matter, especially with the Alderman family in attendance. We know things have been tight for you lately. If formal attire is a concern, it's completely okay to sit this one out. Owen will understand. No one wants you to feel out of place." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slower, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself you've misread something. I hadn't. "Things have been tight for you lately." That was the line. That was the knife dressed up as a favor. Have you ever been dismissed so thoroughly by someone that you actually laughed? Not because it was funny, but because the alternative was something you couldn't afford in that moment. I laughed. One short, sharp exhale. Then I set my coffee down because my hand had started to shake. Let me know in the comments, has someone in your own life ever tried to exclude you under the guise of helping you? Drop your story below. I read every single one. My name is Ivy Callahan Ross. I am 31 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I had spent the better part of a decade allowing my family to construct a version of me that had almost nothing to do with who I actually was. In their version, I was the difficult one, the daughter who dropped out of her pre-med track sophomore year to pursue something impractical, the one who caused a scene at my father's second wedding by being visibly sad about it, which my stepmother had never fully forgiven me for. The one who lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in a city 3 hours away and worked some vague job in tech that nobody quite understood and therefore assumed was failing. My stepmother had been particularly committed to this narrative. She wasn't cruel in an obvious way. She was the kind of woman who delivered wounds with a warm smile and a hand on your arm, so that later, when you replayed the conversation, you almost wondered if you'd imagined it. "We just worry about you, Ivy. You always seem so stressed. Are you sure you're eating enough? It must be hard doing everything alone." My half-brother Barrett, her son from her first marriage, who my father had legally adopted, was the success story. Pre-med, then med school, now a second-year resident at a well-regarded hospital in the city. Good-looking, easy in rooms full of people, the kind of son my father could mention at dinner parties without having to explain anything. Barrett wasn't unkind to me exactly. He just existed in a way that made my existence look insufficient by comparison. And he never seemed to notice. The woman my stepmother was so anxious to impress, Catherine Alderman, was the chief of cardiology at a major academic medical center and had been my father's most prominent colleague for the better part of 2 decades. Her husband ran a healthcare investment group. They were the kind of people my stepmother collected, polished, and displayed at events like trophies. The implication of her note was clear. I was not the kind of thing you put on display. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I read the email. Then I picked up my phone and called my father directly. Not to complain, not to cry. I just wanted to see if he knew she'd sent it. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that slightly distracted quality he'd had my entire childhood. Like part of his attention was always somewhere else. "Ivy, good morning. Did you see the email she sent me?" I asked. A pause. Long enough to answer the question. She mentioned she'd reached out. "Did you read it?" Another pause. "She's just trying to make sure the evening goes smoothly. It's a big night. She told me not to come. She suggested, Dad." I said his name quietly, not angry, not pleading, just placing it there between us like a stone. "She told me not to come to your retirement dinner because she doesn't think I can afford a dress." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sure she didn't mean it that way." I closed my eyes. That sentence had been the operating system of my entire relationship with my stepmother. I'm sure she didn't mean it that way. It was the sentence that had been slowly, steadily teaching me that my discomfort was a perception problem, not a reality problem. I'll figure it out, I told him. Happy early birthday, Dad. I hung up before he could say anything else. Here is what my father did not know, because I had never told him, because he had never asked. 3 years before that Tuesday morning, I had left my position as a senior data engineer at a mid-sized software company and joined a small healthcare AI startup as one of its founding team members. I had taken a meaningful pay cut to do it, which is the part of that sentence my family would have focused on had they known. What they would not have focused on, because they never got the chance, was what happened after. We built a clinical decision support platform for emergency departments, a system that used machine learning to flag early warning signs in patient vitals and lab results, the kind of subtle patterns that get missed during high-volume overnight shifts. It wasn't glamorous in the way Barrett's work was glamorous. There were no patients who shook my hand and thanked me. But the research we published suggested our system had contributed to a measurable reduction in delayed sepsis diagnoses across the hospital networks piloting it. 18 months ago, the company was acquired. I will not state the number here because the exact number is not the point, and frankly, I had spent enough time around people who confuse net worth with worth. What I will say is that I was a founding team member with a non-trivial equity stake. And when the acquisition closed, I became the kind of person who could have bought my stepmother's house and not noticed it on a balance sheet. I still lived in the one-bedroom apartment. I drove the same used Honda I'd had for 6 years. I didn't post about my work on social media because I found it exhausting to explain to people who didn't work in healthcare tech. My family assumed I was scraping by. I had never corrected them, partly because they never asked, and partly because I had stopped needing their opinion of my life to feel secure in it. But that Tuesday morning, something shifted, not into anger. I want to be clear about that. I've seen a lot of stories about moments like this. The reveal, the confrontation, the comeuppance. And they're usually framed as revenge. What I felt was something quieter and more specific. My stepmother had looked at me, decided what I was, and tried to arrange the world around her assessment. And I thought, I'm going to let her see what she's been arranging around. I called my personal stylist, a woman named June who I'd worked with a handful of times for professional events, and asked her to pull some options. She arrived Thursday evening with a rack of gowns and a bottle of sparkling water she knew I preferred to wine. I chose a deep navy silk, structured at the shoulder, completely unadorned. No rhinestones, no cutouts. It was the kind of dress that communicated that the person wearing it had not tried very hard, and that was exactly what it cost. Then I made one other phone call. Dr. Catherine Alderman answered on the second ring. We had met twice. Once at a healthcare innovation conference in Chicago 14 months earlier, and once over a working lunch at her request 3 months after that, when she'd wanted to discuss a potential integration of our platform into her hospital system's emergency protocols. She was precise, intellectually rigorous, and completely without patience for small talk, which I respected enormously. Dr. Alderman, I said, I apologize for the directness of this call. I know Saturday evening is a personal occasion, but I wanted to reach out before then. My father is Owen Callahan Ross. A brief pause. The cardiologist. Of course. You're his daughter? His daughter, yes. I'm also one of the founding team members of Meridian Health AI. I believe we met in Chicago. The quality of her silence changed. Ivy. Yes. Wait, the Meridian acquisition, that was your company. It was. I tried to get a meeting with your team for 8 months before that acquisition closed, she said, and there was something almost amused in her voice. Your VP of partnerships kept rescheduling. I know. I'm sorry about that. He was going through a divorce. She actually laughed at that. A short, real one. Then, are you telling me you'll be at Owen's dinner on Saturday? I will be. Then I'll make sure to find you. There are some things I'd like to discuss about where Meridian's technology goes now that it's inside a larger infrastructure. And I'd like to buy you a drink first, if that's all right. That would be fine, I said. I'll see you Saturday. I set my phone down and sat in my quiet apartment for a while. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. I thought about my father saying I'm sure she didn't mean it that way, and I felt something release, slowly, like a long-held breath. The night of the dinner, I arrived exactly 7 minutes early. I had learned through years of attending events in professional contexts that the person who arrives slightly before the principal guests has an inherent composure advantage. You're already in the room. You already know where the bar is. You're not slightly breathless from parking. The Whitmore Club occupied the top 2 floors of a restored building downtown, the kind of place with hand-lettered menus and staff who called you by name on the second visit. I had been there once before, for a client dinner, and the maitre d' had recognized me when I called to make a reservation for myself and one guest. I was standing near the tall windows overlooking the street when Dr. Alderman arrived. She was with her husband, a quiet, silver-haired man who shook my hand with the firm courtesy of someone who understood exactly who he was talking to without needing to establish it. Dr. Alderman herself looked at me with the specific warmth of someone who has been looking forward to a conversation. "That dress," she said simply, "perfect choice." We were still talking about the post-acquisition integration roadmap, about a new funding initiative her hospital's board was considering, about the particular challenges of getting emergency physicians to trust algorithmic flags without feeling replaced by them, when I heard my stepmother's voice behind me. It was the voice she used in public. Warm, a little performative, shaped like graciousness. Then it stopped. I turned around. My stepmother was standing 4 feet away in a burgundy gown, her hand loosely on my father's arm. My father was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since I was a child. Something caught between pride and something harder to name. Barrett was just behind them, already reaching for a drink from a passing tray, and then he saw who I was standing with, and his hand stilled mid-air. "Ivy," my stepmother said. Her voice had thinned. You made it." "I did," I said. "Happy birthday, Dad." I leaned in and kissed my father's cheek, because whatever else was happening, he was still my father, and it was still his retirement dinner. He held my shoulders a moment longer than necessary when I pulled back. His eyes were doing something complicated. My stepmother started. "Diane," Dr. Ma started. Alderman said, just her name, with the authority of someone who had run a department of 200 people for a decade and a half. "It's lovely to see you. You know Ivy, of course." A statement, not a question. We were just catching up about her work at Meridian. "I've been trying to get her in a room for over a year." She smiled. "I should have known she'd turn out to be Owen's daughter. She has that same quality he has. She makes the complicated look effortless." My stepmother's mouth moved once. Nothing came out. Barrett put his drink down. He was looking at Dr. Alderman and then at me with an expression of genuinely recalibrating attention. "Wait," he said. "Ivy, you were at Meridian Health AI?" "Founding team." He ran a hand through his hair. "I did a rotation at St. Carver's last fall. They'd just rolled out the sepsis flag system." He paused. "I used it twice during overnight shifts. It caught things I wasn't sure I would have caught until later." Another pause, longer. "That was you?" "That was a team of people," I said. "But yes." My father sat down in a chair near the window. Not dramatically, he wasn't that kind of man, but with the deliberate steadiness of someone absorbing something they hadn't known they needed to absorb. "Why didn't you tell us?" he said, quietly. Not accusing. Genuinely asking. I looked at him. My father, who had spent 32 years saving hearts, and had somehow not noticed his daughters. I thought about every dinner where he'd nodded politely when I talked about my work before redirecting the conversation to Barrett's residency. I thought about the email with the different font. "You didn't ask," I said, also quietly, and I stopped needing you to. My stepmother found her voice then. It came out smaller than she intended, I think. "Ivy, I only sent that email because I was worried about you. I wanted to spare you I didn't want you to feel. I know exactly what you wanted," I said. I kept my voice even. Civil. "This was not the moment for cruelty. You wanted an evening that looked a particular way and you didn't think I fit it. That's all right. You were working with the information you had, which is very little. because you never asked for more." She opened her mouth. "I'm not angry with you," I said, and I meant it, which surprised even me a little. "I'm just done being managed." Dr. Alderman's husband, who had been quietly standing to my right in the gracious way of men who have spent decades at events like this, gently placed a hand on my stepmother's arm. "Diane, I believe the seating has opened up. Shall we get settled?" He guided her away with practiced elegance. I would have sent him a thank you note if I'd had his address. What happened next was not a confrontation. I want to be accurate about that, because I have told this story to a few people and they always seem to want it to be louder than it was. My family filed toward their table. My father paused once to look back at me, and I gave him a small nod that meant something I didn't have words for yet. Barrett stopped beside me for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. "Simply, I know you didn't. That system. The overnight shift I told you about." He hesitated. "The patient made it. I found out later." I nodded. I didn't say anything because there was nothing I could add to that. Dr. Alderman and I had dinner at a corner table with her husband and a hospital administrator she'd brought along. A forthright woman named Janet who asked excellent questions and ordered the sea bass without looking at the menu, which I found quietly impressive. We talked for 3 hours. By the end of the evening, there was a preliminary conversation on record about a consulting arrangement that, if it materialized, would be the largest engagement I had taken on since the acquisition. At some point during the salad course, I glanced across the room at my family's table. My stepmother was speaking to someone with her usual warmth, her hand moving in its familiar expressive arc. My father was listening, but his eyes had drifted once or twice to my table. Barrett had his phone out, probably on call, probably a reflex, and he looked tired in the way residents always look tired. A tiredness that has moved past exhaustion into something structural. I felt the strangest thing looking at them. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Something closer to clarity, like a room you've been navigating in dim light that someone has finally illuminated, and you can see exactly where everything stands and make a real choice about where to go next. I left before the cake. I had a work call with a team in London at 9 o'clock. The time difference had been making my Saturdays complicated for months, and I'd told Dr. Alderman as much when we said goodnight. She pressed her card into my hand. "My direct line," she said. "Not the office number. Use it." In the car on the way home, my phone lit up with a text from my stepmother. "It was wonderful to see you tonight. You looked beautiful. We should catch up soon, just the two of us." And then, 30 seconds later, "I didn't realize how well things were going for you. You always seemed so quiet about it." I looked at the text for a moment, then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove home through the quiet dark of a city that had no idea what had just happened and didn't need to. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it. The coffee cup still on the counter, my laptop open to the project file I'd been working on that morning. The small cactus on my windowsill that I'd kept alive for 4 years and considered one of my more significant achievements. I changed out of the navy dress, hung it carefully, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that email 6 days before, the one with the different font. I sat there for a while and thought about what my father had asked. "Why didn't you tell us?" The real answer, the one I hadn't said out loud, was that I had been telling them. For a decade, in every choice I made, I had been telling them exactly who I was. I'd told them when I left the pre-med track, and they'd called it a crisis. I'd told them when I joined a startup for below-market salary, and they'd called it risky. I'd told them when I said I was doing fine, and they'd looked through me like I was a smudge on glass. The problem was never that I wasn't communicating. The problem was that they had already decided what I was, and data that contradicted the model got quietly discarded. People do that. Families especially. They build a version of you when you're young and inexplicable, when you're 17 and difficult, when you make a choice they don't understand, and then they keep referring to that version long after you've left it behind, because the update requires them to admit the original assessment was wrong. It is much easier to keep the old file than to generate a new one. I wasn't going to sit across from my stepmother over coffee and explain myself. I wasn't going to email my father a summary of my career with links to press coverage. That was not the point. The point, and this had taken me a long time to find, longer than I'd like to admit, was that their understanding of me was no longer load-bearing. I had built a life that did not depend on their correct assessment of it. The retirement dinner was not a performance I had arranged. I had simply stopped hiding in the seat they had assigned me. 3 months later, I signed the consulting agreement with Dr. Alderman's network. My father called to congratulate me. Someone had told him the news before I got the chance. He sounded like he was choosing his words carefully, the way you do when you realize you've been in the wrong room for a long time and you're not sure how to mention it. "You've built something remarkable," he said. I had no idea. "I know," I said. There was a pause. Then I should have asked more questions. I let that sit there between us for a moment. It was the closest thing to an apology my father had it in him to give, and I had lived with him long enough to know it. "You can start now," I told him. My stepmother has not sent me an email with a different font since. She sends the same emails she sends everyone else in the family. Forwarded recipes, event reminders, the occasional photo from a dinner that went well. She called once to ask my opinion on a charity gala she was organizing, and I gave her 2 specific recommendations about venue acoustics that she later told me had been very helpful. I do not know if she has ever fully reckoned with what she did. I do not need her to. That is a conclusion that took me some time to arrive at, and I want to say it plainly for anyone who might need to hear it. You are allowed to stop requiring someone's apology in order to be okay. You are allowed to simply move forward without it, and to let the distance that opened up between you stay open, not out of bitterness, but because some gaps exist for a reason. Barrett texted me the following week to ask if I'd be willing to look at some data he was collecting on early warning systems in cardiac care. I said yes. We have a phone call scheduled for next Thursday. It will probably be the most real conversation we have ever had. The cactus on my windowsill is still alive, which continues to please me more than it probably should. I stopped waiting for my family to see me the way I actually am. Not because I gave up on them, but because I realized the waiting had been taking up space I needed for other things. And once I stopped waiting, I found out that the life I'd built in the meantime was exactly the kind of life worth showing up to. The quietest power you can carry into a room is simply knowing, without having to prove it to anyone, that you belong there. By the time anyone else figures it out, you've already moved on to the next thing. What I remember most clearly about that night is not the dress, not the look on my stepmother's face, not even Dr. Alderman's hand pressing her card into mine. What I remember is sitting at my kitchen table afterward with a cup of tea going cold and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I used to think the story of my life was one of survival. I left the path my father had imagined for me, and I survived it. I had a daughter and lost the career track they'd bet on, and I survived that too. I built something quietly, alone, without their validation, and I survived the loneliness of that more than anything. But sitting there that night, I realized survival had never actually been the point. The point was that I had kept going anyway, not because I was waiting for anyone to notice, but because the work itself was worth doing. That's what I want to say to anyone who has ever been handed a smaller version of themselves by someone they loved. The email my stepmother sent me, the one with the different font, the one that said things have been tight for you lately, that email was not actually about me. It was about her. It was about a woman who had decided years earlier what I was and who needed that assessment to remain stable because changing it would require her to admit she'd been wrong. People do that. Families especially. They file you under a category when you're young and difficult and still becoming yourself, and then they resist every piece of evidence that the category no longer fits because the alternative is uncomfortable. I am not angry at her for it. I made peace with that somewhere between the parking garage and the front door of the Whitmore Club. What I will say is this: integrity is not something you perform for an audience. It is the thing you return to when no one is watching. For 10 years, I returned to it every time I chose the harder project over the more comfortable one, every time I stayed at my desk past midnight because the work mattered, every time I showed up for a daughter who needed to see what it looked like to keep going when the people who were supposed to believe in you simply didn't. That quiet, unglamorous persistence is what built the life that walked into that room on a Saturday night and sat down at the center table. Barrett texted me the next week, genuinely about the cardiac data. That mattered to me more than anything else that happened that night. Because it told me that the people we love are sometimes capable of updating their picture of us. Not all of them, not always, but sometimes. And when they do, it's worth being present for. My father said I should have asked more questions, and I told him he could start now. That's integrity too, leaving the door open without pretending the years of distance weren't real. What I know now, having lived this, is that the sharpest version of yourself is not built in the moments people are watching. It is built in the years they aren't, in the decisions that cost you something, in the choice to keep building a life that is genuinely yours even when the people closest to you have decided it isn't worth building. That is where character actually forms. Not in the reveal, not in the confrontation, but in the long, unremarkable middle where you simply refuse to quit. The retirement dinner was not the story. The 10 years before it were the story. The dinner was just the moment the light came on.